Hi folks, welcome to a mini lecture on the back and forth on the trauma and dissociation wars, when I'm going to take you through some of the things that Dalenberg and Lynn argued about in their back and forth, and what Brand et al. And we argued about in a more recent back and forth. Hope you find it interesting, informative, and both in terms of theory, but also in terms of the sociological arguments. Some of the arguments are ad hominem, and it's quite interesting to see those. Okay, hope you enjoy it. Now, this is how Lynn et al. Replied to the Dalenberg et al. 2012 paper. Now, you know that we discussed the Dalenberg 2012 paper in the first lecture, so I won't go over that, but this is how Lynn reviewed the paper. So they say, we review evidence bearing on Dalenberg's 8 predictions and find them largely wanting in empirical support. So they go through each of the predictions and criticize each one. We contend that the authors repeat errors committed by many previous proponents of the trauma model, such as attributing a central etiological role to trauma. In other words, a central causal role. That's what etiological means. So a central causal role to trauma in the absence of sufficient evidence. So they're saying there's a correlation, not necessarily always a cause. They do also say in that paper that there's some areas of agreement, such as there being perhaps a low correlation, and maybe there is a slight causal relationship that's elsewhere in the Lynn paper. And they also go on to say, although a key assumption of the trauma model is dissociative amnesia, the notion that people can encode traumatic experiences without being able to recall them lacks strong empirical support. So that's a little bit similar to my criticism, isn't it? The idea that they're extending the theory to dissociative amnesia, and that is lacking strong support. And they go on to say, accordingly, we conclude that the field should now abandon the simple trauma dissociation model and embrace multifactorial models that accommodate the diversity of causes of dissociation and dissociative disorders. In other words, they want to get away from the assumption of a monocausal system where trauma is usually the cause, and start to think outside the box about other factors, a little bit like what I was saying in the last lecture. So in lecture 1 this week, we talked about the Brand et al. Studies in 2017, and there was 2 of their papers which were actually reviews, not studies. And let's talk about how Harold Merckelbach and myself responded to those. We criticized them in a reply letter shown here. So let's take one of the first criticisms. We say that the Brand et al. Approach may bias expert testimony by assuming the emphasis of the traumatic origins of dissociative experiences. So what we're saying is that there is a potential bias in believing these Brand papers, in that when you see dissociative symptoms, the assumption may be that it's always trauma related. So that's one problem. We go on to say that another problem is that the Brand approach might make experts who present testimony about dissociative symptoms overconfident because they ignore some of the inherent problems of dissociative symptoms reports. And the other problem we say is it may misinform potential expert witnesses on the corpus of knowledge about dissociation because they do not discuss essential parts of the extant literature. So in other words, what we're saying is the experts may not understand the controversy about dissociative amnesia and so on by reading the Brand et al. Studies. Another criticism we had, and this is further down in the paper, we say that Brand et al. Write that there are typical signs of dissociation that the professional world should watch for during the interview with the plaintiff. They mention blank staring, absent appearance, losing track of the conversation, excessive eyelid flutter, and becoming sleepy when difficult topics are discussed. As far as we know, these indicators have not been substantiated by empirical research. One concern is that they are vague enough that if we sufficiently lower our thresholds, we might recognize them in practically everyone. Thus, with this list of behavioral descriptors, a trauma-centric forensic expert may diagnose a traumatic history in every claimant. Indeed, Brand et al.'s list can be compared to the symptoms list in the notorious book, The Courage to Heal. So in essence, we're saying that these symptoms that you might see in individuals in interview are so vague that everybody could be diagnosed as being dissociated. And then, of course, the danger is if you have a trauma-related dissociation model, you're going to start to assume that there's trauma. If they don't report any trauma, then you assume repressed trauma or dissociative amnesia trauma. So you can see it's a potential slippery slope. That's what we're arguing here. We also go on to criticize Brand et al. By saying that Brand et al. State that experts need to be informed that memory deficits, including dissociative amnesia, have been documented in the medical literature for more than a century for a wide range of traumas, including combat and genocides. We disagree about that, so we go on to write, this is an incomplete summary of the state of art as far as dissociative amnesia in forensic domain is concerned. There are convincing case descriptions of people who feigned dissociative amnesia and fugue so as to obtain benefits. Authors of the review papers have noted that in cases where plaintiffs or defendants present with dissociative amnesia, malingering should be considered. And then we also go down to say, a little bit further down, we say, more generally, evidence that the phenomena of dissociative amnesia exists, i.e. experience the trauma, encoding memory of the trauma, yet becoming incapable of recalling them precisely because of the experience was emotionally devastating, is very much in doubt. For example, McNally and Pope undercut the alleged evidential basis of dissociative amnesia, and his analysis still awaits convincing rebuttal. Thus, it is important for expert witnesses to educate the courts that the concept of dissociative amnesia is problematic, even at the most basic level of whether it exists at all. And we finish off our response letter by saying their simple trauma approach, that's Brand et al.'s simple trauma approach, may foster unsupported overconfidence in forensic experts, which ultimately may contribute to incorrect legal decisions. In other words, expert witnesses may become overconfident that they know that traumatic recall or the recall of dissociative amnesia is reliable, and then we may have bad decisions in the court cases where that memory evidence we think should be treated with more caution than the trauma dissociation advocates and forensic psychologists. So there you have it. That was our response to the Brand et al. Papers. Now let me take you through their response to us. So Brand et al. Replied to our article, that was replied to their original article, by saying the following things. So first of all, they addressed our article by calling their response, trauma-related dissociation is no fantasy, addressing the errors in omission and commission in Merckelbach and Patias. And here is a couple of quotes from their paper. They say, unfortunately, many authors and experts misunderstand trauma-related dissociation and are unaware of the large body of research related to it. The commentary by Merckelbach and Patias is a case in point. Many of the statements made by these authors reflect omissions and errors. And they say of us that this lack of knowledge about dissociation research is precisely one of the reasons we wrote Brand et al. 2017. And then right at the end of the paper, they say, we welcome thoughtful, unbiased critiques of our work and research that assists in clarifying if and when trauma may have contributed to the development of dissociation. So that was their response. You know, that end bit there saying that they welcome research of whether trauma causes dissociation and whatnot, that I kind of agree with that. But what Merckelbach and myself were more worried about is assuming that dissociative amnesia is real or produces reliable memories for court cases. After all of these papers were about applying dissociative memory in the court case, you know, so trusting it or not trusting it. And also we were questioning whether trauma leads to dissociative identity disorder too. So there is some agreement that trauma may not always be the cause of dissociation. There's some disagreement about the accuracy of the measures. But where the disagreement is, I think, is dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder. Now, I almost forgot to pull out this quote from the middle of Brand et al.'s paper. So in the middle of their paper, they say something very much fun that we've found quite amusing. So they say that reviews of the full range of published articles find that when accuracy of recovered and continuous trauma memory are compared, accuracy rate was equivalent. And then Merckelbach and Patias present no data to contradict this general finding. And then they go on to say, and this is the interesting part, yes, there are a minority of researchers who refuse to accept any evidence in favor of dissociative amnesia, just as there are a minority of scholars who refuse to accept any evidence favoring global warming, evolution, or the finding that cigarette smoking relates to cancer. Positions that imply that significant expenditure should be made to prevent disasters, that challenge strongly held religious views, or those likely to have forensic implications, will always attract dissident points of view. So clearly they're trying to make the case that Merckelbach and myself are not being scientific in this. We're being like global warming deniers or something like that. That's something that we had fun with in our reply to this criticism. So we responded to that very interesting criticism of our criticism in this paper that I led. So some of the ways of framing the argument here might be similar to what you've heard from me in the past. So I drafted this paper with my colleagues Henry Otgaar and Harold Merckelbach, and this is from the abstract. What we said was Brand et al.'s response, as well as previous works by some of the authors, including the Dalenberg papers and so on, reveal a recurrent and concerning picture of using lengthy but flawed arguments to promote the concept of dissociative amnesia. Our focus here is not so much on the weak to moderate correlation between measures of trauma and dissociation. We concentrate more on the weak evidence for dissociative amnesia. If triers of fact accept there is a correlation between trauma and feeling depersonalized or experiencing memory errors, we foresee relatively few legal consequences. However, if the leap is made to accept that trauma causes dissociative amnesia or even dissociative identity disorder, then it opens the door to repressed memory testimony being trusted in the courtroom, which in the past has had negative consequences. The problem with the concept and theory of dissociative amnesia is that there is an easy-to-miss claim of extraordinary remembering that contradicts findings and theories in memory research. Incorrect beliefs in such extraordinary remembering can have severe repercussions in court. We document some areas of agreement with Brand et al., such as the correlations between trauma measures and dissociation, but reiterate there is a lack of evidence for the mechanisms proposed in dissociative amnesia. So what I was trying to do in this paper is get behind the surface of what we were arguing about. I think what we are really arguing about in a roundabout way is dissociative amnesia and whether it should be trusted in court. I figure that of course that is what we are arguing about, because we are talking about whether, most part when we're talking about dissociation in expert witnesses in court, we're talking about whether you trust memory that has been recalled, that has been blocked for some time, or whether you treat it as weak evidence and you need to look for more evidence, that kind of thing. So I tried to get past the surface with this criticism, and I think it was a good critique here because the way that they responded was quite defensive, so I think we were doing well with this one. Dalenberg et al. Replied to our final submission, our criticism, with this paper published in 2020. Now, I did see this paper before it was published, and it was so inaccurate. I don't think this should have been published, but Psychological Inquiry and Law decided to publish it anyway. So this is the abstract here, and let me just pull out some of the abstract here. They say that we enumerate that and demonstrate our critics' reliance on 8 forms of rhetoric that are largely rejected by the scientific community. We illustrate that these forms of argument using Merckelbach et al.'s published responses in a lengthy debate as exemplars. Recognition of our critics' reliance on these forms of argumentation is crucial to making further substantive progress in the debate. So I thought this was very ironic because if you remember in an earlier paper, they were using ad hominem kind of attacks on us, relating us, for example, to those who climate change deniers and so on and so on. So I really did not agree at all to this, and I contacted my colleague Harold Merckelbach to ask him if he wanted to do a reply, and I think he was tired of it by this time. So I think the general approach we have is, we just say it as straight as we can, and at a certain point you have to just trust that you've written out your response as well as you can, and leave it for people who think logically to assess the different debates. Who wins a debate if you use a falsifiable approach, if you think carefully about measurement, cause and effect, and so on, correlation not being equal to cause, and you read both sides of the debate, Lynn et al. Versus Dalenberg and Brand et al. Versus Patius and Merckelbach, then it's really up to the reader to decide who won the debate. So from what we've talked about today, you can see the logical arguments and the evidence are balanced between the two camps, but also you can see the sociological battle that's going on and the back and forth and the unfair criticisms and so on that I think you might find interesting. So that's why I've included things like the accusation that we were climate change deniers. I thought that was quite amusing. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. So there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed that lecture where we talked about Dalenberg et al.'s research synthesis of trauma and dissociation correlations, then Stephen Lynn's reply to that in 2014. So basically we're arguing against the trauma model. Dalenberg et al. called our side of the debate the fantasy model. I don't kind of like that terminology. I would not call myself somebody who's a proponent of a fantasy model. I am a critic of the idea that we can always assume trauma when you have dissociative symptoms. I think it's dangerous to assume that trauma is a cause. Even though I admit that stress can lead to memory problems and so on, I just think it should be more exact. And then we also talked about the Brand et al. Versus Merckelbach and Patius debate, where we were talking about substantive differences of opinion on how far you can extrapolate data on trauma and dissociation, how good the measurement is. How Merckelbach was quite big on showing that fantasy proneness correlates with some of these dissociative symptoms, something that I don't talk about much, but Harold does. And my approach was more to say that it doesn't really prove dissociative amnesia and dissociative identity disorder. So I hope you enjoyed the little drama. It's not really something that is that much fun to be a part of the debate because, and I'm not the only false memory researcher to feel this way, we feel that the length of these articles on trauma and dissociation obscure what they're trying to say and obscure the real message, which is something more simple, such as these correlations prove that trauma causes dissociation, and prove that if you have dissociated, you can assume trauma, and prove that dissociative amnesia is a real thing and dissociative identity is a real thing. And that is what I'm critical of, and I wish, the communication of their position was clearer, because I think there's a trap there for individuals to, see the fairly good research measuring trauma and dissociation, and then to not notice the extensions to extending the evidence beyond what it is actually showing. So I don't know what you guys think about all this. Did Merckelbach and I and my colleague Stephen Lynn do a good enough job in our responses to these papers? If not, tell me, because I think we may have won the debate. If we are falling short, maybe I should write something again. And indeed, we have written some things about this since then, such as our Otgaar and or et al. Papers since then about the return of the repressed. So I think when you combine that argument, I think our argument gets stronger, but I still think we can improve our argument about trauma and dissociation. So I'm working on that, and I think after I've taught this course a few times, I think my argument may get better on this front. So I may write a book about this once I've taught this course a couple of times. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for listening.